Welcome to the Depth Dialogues podcast,
where we explore how depth psychology is applied to tackle contemporary social issues.
I'm Kirk Schneider.
And I'm Tyler Gamlin.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today on Depth Dialogues, we're honored to welcome Jim Hernandez, a remarkable individual whose journey is nothing short of transformative. For 15 years, Jim was involved in gang life, a journey filled with significant hardships, notably the loss of his brother during a gang confrontation. Despite such hardships, Jim turned his life around, using his own experiences to inspire and guide others. Jim has taught violence prevention for the Concord, California Police Department, working to break cycles of harm and offer hope to young people caught in the grips of gang life. Drawing inspiration from the philosophy of Kierkegaard, Jim opens doors for young gang members to envision a different future for themselves. A pivotal moment in Jim's journey was discovering the work of Rollo May. Deeply moved by May's approach to psychology and the human condition, Jim formed a personal connection with him, which led to a years-long mentorship and friendship that profoundly shaped his life path. Today, Jim's passion and purpose are reflected in his role as the founder and director of the Center for Inner Peace in Red Bluff, California. This sanctuary serves as a space for spiritual growth and healing. The center offers free counseling, mentoring, art and music lessons, outreach to individuals in crisis, hospice visitation, and grief counseling. Please join me in welcoming Jim Hernandez to the Depth Dialogues podcast.
Thanks very much, Tyler. And I am so deeply heartened to have you here, Jim Hernandez, whom I've known for some 30 years, and we've shared a number of ventures together. I'll let you go into more detail, but it's wonderful to reconnect with you, Jim. And I should say that Jim is also featured in the book Awakening to Awe, Personal Stories of Profound Transformation, where Jim was one of my interviewees for that work. And Jim has certainly made major transformations in his life, from very challenging early circumstances to, I would say, a kind of awe-based existence that you offer to many, and very profoundly to this day. So I'd like to begin with your story. If you could capsulize for us how you emerged from a very difficult childhood, and I also am aware of participation in a Latino street gang as a youth, where you witnessed many murders, including the murder of your younger brother, I believe, in gang warfare, to becoming a youth educator and working with, I believe it was the Concord Police Department, as a gang mediator, and so much more that you brought your artistic and counseling skills to the fore in helping our youth. So I'll let you begin, Jim. Tell us some about your story of emerging into applying depth principles, existential principles of therapy, really, to working with extremely challenged youth.
Thank you, Kirk, and thank you, Tyler, for the invitation to be here, to have this dialogue, and to share some thoughts. And I'm hoping that those who will be watching this will have the opportunity to view this. But some of the things that I'll be sharing are maybe new to them, and some may be a review, and some may also be a new way or different perspective of seeing the things, in depth. Or depth psychology and not only just its application, but its relevance and its significance. And because we're all searching for something. We come to this world, and the first thing we're searching for is the breast. Okay, that's our sustenance. We're rooting. You're like a baby little a mouse does. You see it just moving its nose around till it finds what it's searching for. And our soul does the same sort of searching throughout our life, I find, and I believe, and it's very disheartening when we come across a dead end. We're searching and searching and nothing comes up. But it's very awesome, as you put in your book, when we do make that connection. And I was able to make that connection years ago with yourself and Rollo May, and have both of you and learn from you privately, and to be able to add and contribute to the counseling work I was beginning to do at the time. So my story starts from as a teen, as a young person, coming from a very, very tumultuous, very violent home. My father would go off and rage and beat us when he was drunk, and over just petty little things, insignificant things. And I became violent myself and took that to the streets and ended up incarcerated. And that was actually, I look back, my way of getting out of that home. Was going into a different environment and being locked up, and then it was kind of more of an even playing field with my peers, that who was the toughest or who wasn't, and that sort of thing. And when I got married at an early age and had children, but I didn't repeat that pattern with my children, the physical violence and so forth. And I'm not really a violent person. I don't care to be a violent person, but I was pushed into it, and unfortunately things went bad for a lot of people, including, as you mentioned, the killing of my brother. And that was very difficult. To hold him in my arms while he died and took his last breath, and to not be able to see anything but the perspective I was brought up and stuck in. That I could not see there was a bigger picture to this whole tragedy, and how we play, and how everybody played a role in it, and how it could have been. We could have a different role. And so years after my brother had passed, and it was December 86, my second wife left me, and it was very, very tragic for me. I was deeply in love with her. She left me for someone else. And I sought out a counselor, and I found a therapist. We went to couples counseling, and she wasn't all for it. So I continued on with this therapist. Her name is Paula. She has since passed. And what Paula saw in me, I could look back now, was, okay, this young man here has some potential. It's not hidden, but it's well and alive behind the facade that he's putting up in front of himself for to be likable, to be a person, and so forth, coping mechanisms, we could call it. And so I continued with the therapy, and 11 or 10 months into this journey with her, I lost my 11-year-old son, and he had fallen, hit his head at school, was in a coma for a week, and I took him off life support at the end of it and held him while he died. The doctor said it would take 10 minutes for his heart to stop beating, and I had my head on his chest, and I heard that his last little heartbeat, and I'm like, this is real, this is, where do I go from here? And I continued in my therapy. At the time, I was in San Francisco going through an anger management group called MOVE, Men Overcoming Violent Emotions. It's a 16-week program, and it was kind of amazing to the other participants when halfway through it, when I revealed that I was there voluntarily. Everybody was court mandated. They all looked at me like, "Why are you here? You don't have to be." I need to be here, And then from there, I started volunteering. I went to a lot of grief groups. Had individual grief counseling and grief groups that I went to, and ended up becoming a volunteer with the agency. And I started with the hotline as a hotline counselor. And one Sunday morning, I picked up answered the phone, and there was a gentleman that was, after a good while, I talked him into putting down a gun and not taking his own life. And so when I hung up the phone, I just kind of felt like I was like not genuine. I don't have the credentials to be a therapist. It was just luck. And I'm like, no. So I went to the library I remember a little quote I had heard, study the monad and you will know the universe. And my brain, the way it is, I went to the library and I got a book on physics and I said, I'm going to start with the hydrogen atom and build my way up. And on my way to check out the book, there was this bin of VCR tapes. And I like rummaged through it, like, I can get a free tape here too. And I came up with this tape of all things. It was meant to be. And the title of the tape was, it was by Rollo May, in Psychology and the Human Dilemma. And I went home and I watched it. And he just spoke to me. He spoke to me who was behind the facade. And I was just so moved, and like, wow. I was working in a print shop in San Francisco at the time. So I shared that with a coworker and she said, hey, you know that he lives here in the Bay Area? And I'm like, no way. And so I called him up. I got his number and information, gave him a call, told him I saw his tape and it really moved me. And I'd like to sit down and talk with him about it sometime. And he said, well, I really don't. And I didn't realize that it was towards the end of his life and he was pretty busy. And he says, but call me back in 5 minutes and I'll give you the number of a colleague. And I think he can help you a lot with it. So I'm like, okay. So I called him back and he gave me Kirk's number. Give me your number, Kirk. So I gave you a call. And we spent about 2 years privately. You instructed me, and it was very helpful because I had also took the training for a grief counselor, adolescent grief counselor, and I was able to take a lot of things that you were sharing me and coming in. And one of the things that stood out the most that you shared with me in my training with you was that, Jim, you said, Jim, what you want to really tune into is what is palpably present. Mm-hmm. And not just palpably present with the person, but what is palpably present between the two of you in the room itself. And when you can zero in on that, when you can really zero in on that, to me, it's like that's where the magic takes place. Because then the client and what's palpably present to me is more than my therapist talked a lot about the container. And it was very nice to have that container of her office. Kirk, I've been into the original private office that you had there on Union Street, and your other one is like, this is like a really nice, safe, feels like a safe place, But to me, the true container, I should say, within the container is what is palpably present, that it can come up and be seen, can be heard, it can be, and therefore it has the potential to be understood.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for conveying very heartfelt and present testimony to your life path and what's brought you here. And Jim, can you say a little more about specific people, perhaps, that you've helped? I mean, obviously not their names, but specific examples of where you brought these principles to bear with particular gang members or young people who have been living very tormented lives. I think it would speak to a lot of people suffering today as well.
Oh, yes. And so as I was working in the print shop, San Francisco, early or late 91, I was working with you and consulting with you and Rollo. I'd go to work and I'd pick up the paper at lunchtime. I come from the East Bay, another gang killing, another kid killed, it was just all through the news, And I had realized something. I said, the one thing that isn't happening here is that people aren't dealing with the grief and of a violent act, of a horrible act that they've witnessed, or their loved one is gone. And I gave a 6-month notice to a print shop, and I said, I'm just going to go out in the world. I'm feeling called to go out and make it. I got to take it to them. They can't come to it for a lot of different reasons. So that's where I consider myself an outreach crisis counselor. I go to where I'm going to be called and it's going to be needed. And then that following January, the crisis and suicide intervention agency I was volunteering for had gotten a small grant to do a day workshop, and they asked me to take the part to speak on grief and loss from a violent act. So I did the workshop, and at the end of it, these three teachers who came from working at this volatile school said, we could sure use you at our school. I'm like, well, I'm just here for the day, and thank you for that. So that summer in '92, I let you and Rollo know that hey, I'm kind of like going to go out into the world and see what I can do. And that's when I called Rollo, and I said, Rollo, I think I want more from you. No offense, Kirk. I want more from you of what I'm hearing to like more than just a training, but these insights, what I can take to people. And he was very kind. He says, well, aren't you still working with Kirk? I'm like, yes. He goes, well, I'm going to share something with you, Jim. And Rollo was very insightful. He could see behind the facade, and not just like what people were hiding, but with the potential of what there was for a person. And he said I won't say these aren't exact words, but here's what he said to me. He said, Jim, I could tell that you're onto something uniquely of your own. And I have the word for it now. I didn't know, and it's a calling to be able to help people. And he says, and here's my, and I know what you want from me. I know what you're seeking here, but I'm going to deny it to you, and I'm going to tell you why. And it was very humbling. He says of him, he's a beautiful soul. He says, because I'm afraid that if I give you what you're looking for, it may interfere with the path that you're on. And you have a calling of your own, and it might throw you in a whole different direction. And so I was disappointed, and that's when he said, okay, he said, have you read my book, The Art of Counseling? I said, no, I haven't. It says, well, come over to my house and I'll give you a copy. And he autographed it for me. And we sat down and had a nice dialogue, that one that I'll always treasure. And so where I'm going to set the premise or the tone of what I'm going to be speaking to, so it's helpful for other people, practitioners and people who can listen to this, is that it's the dichotomy. I wouldn't say the dichotomy. It's the dualism side by side of conversation and dialogue. And Kirk, in Tyler, you've had many conversations with people, and you go to a party, and sometimes I remember back in the old days, our days, Kirk, someone would buy a piece of art or something and say it's just a conversation piece starter. I just have it there so people we'll start a conversation when people are here. And then there's dialogue. So a conversation to me is to be able to have a conversation with someone, to elicit a conversation, much like look at Forrest Gump sitting there on a bus stop, and the whole movie is about this conversation, his life to this woman sitting on a bench, and he finds out at the end he's sitting on the wrong bench. That's not the bus, the bench for the bus he's going to catch. And so I've had a lot of conversations in my life, and what I heard Rollo May speaking to me in that interview, it was a dialogue with him, and not just him and Jeffrey Mishlove. It was a dialogue with him in existence itself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, Kirk, early on, you introduced me to Rollo's books and Freedom and Destiny, and you had me zero in on the chapter, The Significance of the Pause. Mm-hmm. And that just touched me. And it's like, okay, here it comes. And what all this stuff was doing was feeding into that calling. And so then you introduced me to Kierkegaard. And I just fell in love with Kierkegaard. I could understand where he was coming from. Kierkegaard's work, I know, is difficult for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, because they're looking for a conversation. They're looking for what he's trying to tell you how to do things. And he specifically says it throughout all his books. I'm not trying to instruct you what to do here. I'm just giving you some insights and suggestions for everybody's own calling, and for that solitary individual, which is engraved on his headstone, where he's laid to rest. And so, by reading Kierkegaard, I was able to hear. I'm listening for two things when I read people's works. I'm looking for the conversation that's happening, and also for the dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I read everybody from Karl Jaspers to Fromm to Frankl to all these people that Tillich, and I'm currently reading, and I'm loving it. Rollo May's book on Paul Tillich,
Right.
And I sum it down to one word, it's about friendship. And as we conversation starts, is the beginning to to initiate, excuse me, a friendship. And throughout the years, Kirk, as you and I have, we had the dialogue continues. We pick up where we left off. You and I have done a lot of. We've had lunch and dinner together and co-presented at conferences and ideas back and forth with each other. So with this calling, then I ended up, in literally being able to take this existential thoughts, these teachings, whether it was Kierkegaard and and all these people, because I looked at it from a perspective that it's a universal dialogue. It's going out throughout time of the whole human race. Kierkegaard's book, The Present Age, speaks to that. Okay, what is going on? What is palpably present, like right now today? What is palpably present in our present age today? December 11th, 2024. And how are people responding to it? How is it affecting them? And how can we go deeper into it to understand it and to address it and to engage it? And so, as I went out into the community to look for this calling, I saw this advertisement this woman put. It was Mothers versus Gangs, and she had an organization she started to stop the gang violence. And I called her up, and she says, "Hey, there's this probation officer that's starting a gang diversion program at the Boys Ranch where I did time when I was a young kid." So I went out there. And he was happy to have somebody to volunteer. I'm like, sure. And then a month later, I was going through the war-torn area where I grew up in, and I said, I'm going to start a grief group here if I have to pay for it out of my own pocket. I went to the civic center in the city and to rent a room. And she says, she gave me a card to somebody. She goes, maybe if you go to a nonprofit organization, they could help you. And I said, no, I have the funds. It'll be okay. So I called the person, left a message. He was with the Violence Prevention Coalition of Contra Costa County. He returned my call all excited. He says, "Hey, instead of the grief work, you're doing this gang work. Would you think about doing gang work?" I'm like, okay. So we went to the high school, and the principal said yes. He was happy to have me on board. And I asked for the name. I remember the name of one of the teachers that had come to the workshop earlier that year that I presented at her. And I went to her classroom. She says, "Hey," I said, "Hey, Lana, looks like your prayers were answered." She's like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, "I'm going to be volunteering here." She says, "Are they paying you?" And I go, "No." And she says, "Hold on." And she gets on the phone. She calls HR. And just that day, they had gotten funding and had a job listed for a gang mediator. And I talked to the guy on the phone. He says, "You're hired." Yeah. And I just hit the feet running. Now I'm working with these kids that are hardcore kids, and I didn't know how I was going to approach them, but I looked at it in the sense of, okay, here's not the strategy. I have the ability, because I've come from the world, to befriend them. Mm-hmm. And I did, one by one, group by group. As a matter of fact, when I had the first group of 50 of them came in the room, the leader of the gang gave the instructions, if we smell that he's even a cop or anything, we're going to beat him down with the chair and send a message that don't bring people in here. And they knew I was genuine. And so that group of young people that I met, there was an African American gang, there was Asian Laotian gangs, there was Filipino gang members, there was rival Hispanic gang members. And my neutrality was this. But I was amazed, since I had changed in the 10 years that I was active in it. Now they had this thing divided of colors. Norteños, Sureños, Blue, Red, Bloods, and Crips. I had no idea what they were doing, but it was that was the new madness that emerged. But where I was able to be most effective and bring in these existential teachings that are universal is that when they asked me, they would ask me, "What did you use to claim?" Now, if I'm working with a bunch of blue raggers and I used to claim red, then they're not going to have anything to do with me. But if I claim blue, then the red raggers aren't going to talk to me because he's with them. But when I said that I had never claimed anything, we didn't do that back in my days. So it was a neutral place, and that's where I could get the dialogues going. The conversation and the dialogues became very deep. One of the conversations that came into a deep dialogue was this. When I took the job, and of course I was nervous and I didn't know what was going on, but I just kept remembering Kirk's and Rollo's teachings, the encouragement, like, okay, I got this. How can I help them help themselves? Instead of coming with techniques, now I have to know their everyday lives. And it's pretty soon I was invited to parties and quinceañeras, and I was in places that were getting shot up or funeral homes, and and helping them through it. And then this is what crossed my mind, and I think this in the sense of I can sum up Kierkegaard in one little phrase, in a sense that I think would be helpful for people to know where he's coming from, and that is this: that how can I help somebody understand or bring peace to what they're struggling with if I haven't gone there myself? He watched his father go through a horrible hell when he lost his mother and siblings all at once in illness, and he saw what it did to his father. He saw how devastating it was.
You're talking about Kierkegaard here?
Yes, Kierkegaard in his life story. And so I had this thought. I said, what would happen now that I'm befriending these young people, if one of them came to me and said, hey, I want to forgive the person who killed my friend, my cousin, whoever it was. I said, I can't take him there because I never forgave the killer of my own brother. I had sworn back then one day I would still get revenge, on him. And I thought about it not very long, because I thought again for my own. I reached inside my own self to say, okay, how would it benefit other people if you had made peace with that and you could take them there?
Yeah,
and so I always had the contact number of the person who killed my brother, as I mentioned, and I called him. I called him on a Friday evening, and I said, hey, and I won't say his name. I said, hey, it's me, and you know who it is. And I was always going to get you one day. He's like, yeah, I know that. I said, I'm calling to tell you I'm going to forgive you for having killed my brother. It was a mess that we were all in, and we all had a part in it. And unfortunately, I have to let it go, because that anger, that hatred in me, that I have to keep present. My analogy is like a pilot light on a gas stove. You got that lit, so if I ever saw him, I could just hit the dial and go off on him. I said, that was there when I conceived my kids. It's there when I changed their diapers. It's there when I go to work. I don't want it there anymore.
It takes energy.
Yes. And so I said, I forgive you, and I pray that you find peace. And he said, I won't have any peace. I realize now that I took an innocent life, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. Now, my mother had given me his letter jacket from high school. And I had always had my brother's name was Danny. And I went to the closet, and I pulled out his jacket, and I sat on my living room floor, and I cried and I wept like I had never cried before. It was resolved. Now, the other thing that happened, though, was I still had that part of myself that, you live by the code, you die by the code, that stuff. I knew that now that once I had crossed that line and forgave him, I can't take it back. In that world, I would be seen as weak. And I felt that weakness, and I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror for 2 days. But I just sat with it, and all the things that Kirk, that Rollo, that my therapist were advocates for and promoting and supporting. By the end of 3 days, it kicked in. And there it was. Like, okay, it's that void is now being filled with all these, these other things. And
so that pause was really important.
Yes. And now to this day, I've taken quite a few people, family members, to that place of forgiveness, to be able to forgive. And early on with my therapist, her name is Paula. One day I came into her office. Well, I was still going through the divorce, like months into it. And she says this to me. She said, Jim, every week you come in here, it's fine. You're paying the money, and you talk about what's going on. I'm like, okay, this is why I'm here, talk about things, right? She said, but I'm just curious. I'm like, yeah. She says, instead of talking about your situation, can you speak from it? And I had no idea what she meant. And me, I felt like embarrassed or dumb or whatever. Like I want to be, I need to know everything, right? And pretend like I do. And I struggled with it, and I could see her, and I'm like, okay, she's like, ooh, I think I kind of moved on him too fast, trying to get him to open up. He's resisting. Here comes, the resistance and stuff. And I said, Paul, I'll be honest with you. The reason I'm not answering your question is I don't understand it. And she says, stop right there, Jim, you're doing it. Like, now you're speaking from it instead of about it. And that was major to me. And so my work over the years with so many people is to be able to get in a place where they can comfortably, and as a friend, speak from their experiences, because there's where the depth is, when they can speak from it.
Mhm.
And over the years, and we've talked more about that, people that I was called to help were families, communities, and I've worked with people by the thousands, and individuals, and so forth. But I was able to take not only, again, the existential teachings from you, Kirk, and from Rollo, and from Kierkegaard, they call from the dust, but be able to see that where it can be applied in any present age and in any present moment.
But if we could just reel back to that kid who wanted to take vengeance, how did you bring that personal relating to him? The shift that you went through of being able to pause, to take some time to bake it in a way.
Hmm.
And also the friendship that you were co-creating with him. Were those the basic
Oh yes,
things
oh yes.
of his transformation? Do you recall?
Oh, vividly, because I'm still friends with him to this day. All these kids that I started with, quite a bit of them were hardcore gang members. They're now in their late 40s. They have families. One of them is actually, she's the got reelected as mayor of in East Bay City.
Wow.
Others are school principals. I mean, that was their path. If they weren't caught up in all the drama and the craziness of the streets, they would have ended up there anyway. That's what they were headed to. And so his name is Julio. Now, excuse me if I get a little emotional here, and that's okay. It's where we're at. See, as I befriended these kids over the years, I've been pretty shut down for the last 10 years or so. My heart closed itself and protects it, because a total of 29 of these young kids that I've worked with, befriended, are dead. Some brutally murdered, some murdered trying to do the right thing in moments where I was helping them to get through it. Others drug overdoses, car accidents, because it wasn't just a gang, because later on I worked with after school programs. I worked with troubled youth. Once I got past all the troubled youth, I could start working to these kids, just the regular normal kids who could use some guidance and some mentoring. And so with Julio, the first person I lost in this work, her name was Cecilia Rios. It was a big thing, the story in Richmond, California. She was the girlfriend of Julio. And she went out one night to borrow video from her friend, and she never made it home. She was found the next morning in a stairwell with her throat slit and raped and brutally butchered. And I helped them through it. The media was all over it. The police were accusing the parents and Julio of an insurance thing. All kinds of craziness was happening. Plus my own grief of this little girl. Mm-hmm. And walked and talked with her father about it. It was a bizarre, it's like fiction story. She didn't show up, and this guy who just came from Mexico, was a long lost brother of one of the gang guys, followed her after he left. She left and killed her. And that following morning, the mother had a dream of where she was and went straight to the body. And when I talked to the father, he says, to help him through it, I said, "How are you doing?" He's like, "Jim, I sat there with my daughter in that state, laying in a pool of blood." And he says, "But I saw her eyes turn to the left. And all I know is that my daughter was strong. And when she could no longer take what this world was throwing at her, she looked in a different direction." And that brought him solace. That brought him some comfort. And so when the killer was actually caught, finally, they found out who he was. And I had a suspicion who it was. We were at the house. The media, I already knew who it was because the journalist, I was working a lot with the media, called me and said that and revealed that who they were going to announce at a press conference. And when it was all done and said, we went back to her house and we were in her bedroom, me and Julio and his gang members. And then he said, okay, he was convinced that his brother, the brother of the suspect, knew all along. And we had gone by there and asked questions. He said, so he lied to me and he knew. He goes, he's out. He basically put a hit on him. And I'm standing right there, and I'm like, okay, Julio. And he's just like, no, Jim, there's no talk, there's no dialogue, there's no conversation over this, nothing. I said, Julio. And he started getting really, they're walking down the house, they're making their move, and I'm following, and we get to the street. I said, Julio. And he says, what? He's, Jim, no. And he got mad. He barked at me like, what? You know, he just yelled at me. Because now he's full of passion. He's going to go kill this guy. They're going to go take him out. I said, Julio, you do what you feel you got to do. I'm not going to stop that. But all I got to do is say this. And it sounds, some people this may sound a little conflicting, but this is the moment. This is how it worked out. I said, because if you're going to do it, wait till after the funeral. Because if you go do it right now and you get caught, you're going to miss all that. They have that final, the closure with her. And he says, yeah, okay, Jim, you know, and he took off in the carloads. One of the gang members asked me to take him to ride. I was trying to get to the house ahead of them to get him out of there. It was too late. I got there and they were all in the room. And so I said, okay, but he was calm. He heard what I said, and we basically held a trial. And he said, Jim and I are going to look, you know, we're going to do this. And if we find out that he's lying, the truth, then what's going to happen is going to happen. So I walked him through it. We walked him through it, and we were able to substantiate that he had no knowledge. As a matter of fact, he was the one that turned the brother in when his brother told him he had done it. Mm-hmm. So then Julio turned around, looked at all the guys in the room, and says, nobody touches him for this. If you have any problems, you talk to me and Jim. But we had a dialogue. See, it wasn't just a conversation. This dialogue went deep. And in the moment was that, okay, wait a minute, everybody. Our friend is dead. My girlfriend is dead. She's in the funeral home. You know, we've got to be present for that, for her family, for ourselves. And he moved beyond that. After that, he started going with me to talk to other gangs about to divert them and to do the work, and got him out of it himself. And I'll share this story. This is a really cute story in that sense that, you know, pretty soon in gang situations or parties when stuff was jumping off, he'd help me jump in there with me and break it up. Like, hey, stop, you know. And they listened, like we're not going to go there. And so one morning I saw him at a party that they were having for his younger brother. And I said, hey, Julio, there's a quinceañera, there's a party, you know, celebration of Latino girl turns 15, quinceañera. I said, are you going to be the quinceañera tonight? Because then he was like, help keep the peace. Because sometimes there'd be up to 100 gang members show up after sort of the party part. Mm. And he says, no, I'm not going to make it. I'm like, oh, okay. I'm just curious what's going on. You know, it's like, you okay? He's like, no, man. Hey, Jim says, remember you keep telling us like there's more to this world, that we could venture out. We're not just stuck in this hood. Like, he goes, well, the other day I got on BART. I went to Berkeley. I was walking around and I found an ice skating place. I'm taking some of my homeboys ice skating tonight. And I said, I'm going with you. So it was hardcore on ice that night. And we were just going around the rink, having the fun, you know, their kids, just having fun. Yeah. You know, to this day, he's doing good. He was a bus driver for a while. Now he's driving a garbage truck. He owns a couple of homes, rental homes. He's got a good life. His children, they don't even know about his past. And so being able to take him, not just through it, but and share my story, you know, not like, okay, well, Jim has done it, like he's done the cold plunge, let's go do it. It's like, well, he seems to be pretty at peace with himself in spite of it all. I want some of that. Show me how this, show me how this works.
And there's something about, there's the more, helping him come into the more of living.
Whatever that is for him.
Mm-hmm. Whatever that is for him, you didn't get in his way, like Rollo didn't get in your way. But you were there. You were deeply present for him, sharing your emotionality, not just your head. Mm-hmm. But sense it was your whole bodily being in connection with him, and making that powerful, intuitive call to him to pause, to give it some time, especially time that you will need, that is vital to you, to mourn your girlfriend, right?
Mm-hmm.
Girlfriend?
Yeah, his girlfriend.
Girlfriend, yeah. you knew that was really important for him to experience, and it may also open him to the more of life, uh, the future, you know, what really matters about living. I mean, there's so many layers there that seem to open up with that sort of invitation, suggestion to him. And it's amazing how that really was the turn. And so,
Oh, yes. And when we look at the aspect of the realm of violence itself, and then later on, I was employed by the Concord, California Police Department,
Hmm.
and worked side by side with officers who are also being very brutal to people.
Mhm.
To be in a situation where this is going on, all of a sudden some of the cops are looking over at me, see their conscience came back to like, okay, let's stop hitting them. This isn't right, or it's not proper, you know. Even had one police officer, we stopped a gang member, and I always stayed in the car because I didn't want to have the interaction if something happened and they associate me with that, you know. Hey, Jim's standing over there, because I could obviously suddenly, if things go wrong, I could step in. And we had that worked out. The police had to kind of like come to their aid, and they're like, okay, well, he got me out of that jam with the cop, you know. And then the sergeants would rotate in about every 3-4 years. And this new sergeant came in, and I was going past his office one day, and he says, Jimmy, get over here. Oh, I'm like, okay, what's going on with Tony? He was a rough guy. He was SWAT team. He was special enforcement team, you know, one of those rough guys. And he goes, close the door. I'm like, okay, Tony, just have a seat. Okay, what's going on? I'm like, okay, I'm in trouble. I don't know what's going on. He's like, I need your help. He's like, what do you mean? He's like, with this new position I had, he was sergeant of youth services bureau. I worked in our bureau. He's like, I got to be nice to people. And I'm just kicked down. I don't know how to be nice. You got to teach me fast. How do I be nice to people? I go, I got you, Tony. I'll coach you with this. You got it. And he and I are really good friends today. He's a nice guy. I mean, because that nice guy was really, what he revealed to me in that, you know, in the depths of himself, that there is a nice guy in there.
Mhm.
Person behind, not even behind a badge or the uniform, but he's a nice guy, and he's being called forward. There's his calling now. The nice guy in here, and when I say calling, it's not so much a calling of what we air quotes do, but what part of ourself is being called forward to be of service,
Yeah.
to be of help, to be there for people. And so now this part of himself that he knew he was nice is going to come forward, but it could be hard for him too, because his conscience could start to bother him. It's very uncomfortable being nice, and it's easy just to be unnice, you know. And that goes a long way. This pan back to this away from everything of the violence, and I'll show you with Kierkegaard yourself, with Rollo helped me to really see what was palpably present in this situation. Once I started working with the gang members, and I knew them personally, and who their brothers were, who their cousins were at school, and so on and so on, you know. And when they started talking to me about their enemies, they're like, yeah, we've all known each other since elementary school. I'm like, wait a minute, in my day, see, you really didn't know each other because there were different neighborhoods, different, you know, areas that warred against each other. We were completely anonymous to each other. And I said, well, wait a minute, if you guys were friends, what are you doing? Why are you killing each other like crazy? I mean, it's astronomical. And I said, okay, so once I start to realize, and here's what I realized what it was. It was resentment was palpably present. Resentment to the point where the anger, the rage took over, and now someone is dead. So I came up with my own little hypothesis, thinking, okay, I look back at Kierkegaard's work. I was reading Karl Jaspers and Fromm, especially Escape from Freedom. And I'm trying to see, you know, what is the predicament for humans right now with this resentment? Okay. That you can read a lot where people, you hear how resentment has just taken over everything. And then how do we move beyond it? How do we address it? I said, okay, once I started seeing that, and now I became friends with their old friends in different gangs. I was out with Lindy Yee. The interesting thing that happened along the way, the media just swarmed all over me. So I was on the news every night, and it was positive stuff. And Lindy Yee was one of them, and we did this a 3-part special called "Kids in the Hood." And a year later, we came back to see where their lives were at. And so with having become friends with all these different sides, and so one night we're doing this on that special. It was a Laotian gang, and from Laos, they were basically city people, and the other gang was called the Sons of Death, and they were Mien. They were from the mountainous region, and we were doing this story. And I went to go pick up the leader where he was, and by the time I came back, the police had showed up. And so we explained everything, what we're doing, and while we were filming it, a carload of the SODs came through there. And all of them ducked back. They had their guns, and like the news crew ducked back. I walked up to the car, and I would do this quite often because I would put myself in the middle. I'm going to be the first person to get shot, killed here. That they didn't pull the triggers. It's Jim. We can't hurt Jim. It's both sides. And I walked up to him and I said, "Hey," his nickname, called him by. He was driving. I said, "Why are they crossing out our names?" I said, "I really don't know, but and those guys are like, okay, nobody really had seen this as they welcome the excuse to not to have to get violent, where before when they were confronted with each other, like we got to show face,
You have to, yeah.
And then so it didn't happen, and this happened many times. I mean, being brawls and things are starting, and somebody puts a gun in my face, and I know I got like a split second to disarm that, and I would, in one case that happened, and guns right here in my face, and I said, "Hey." And as I've been in these situations, I said, the cops have already been called, shots are going off. I said, if a cop comes around the corner right now and sees you before you see him, they're going to be all over you. Like, "Oh yeah, you're right." And he just instantly put the gun in his pocket and walked away. I'm like, okay. And so the resentment, see, that's what was palpably present. So then here was my thoughts. If I can be instrumental through all the existential teachings I have and stuff, this pull from this, of how to reduce the resentment by really getting at by really going in depth into their lives. Then, if there's if there's no resentment, then there isn't this sort of volatile violence. And so I put it to the test. I went to work at the city of Concord, and it was on the beginning stages of gang violence. The biggest city in the county, 125,000 people, with up and coming, growing gang problem. And because I went into schools, and I did three things actually. I developed a life skills curriculum and 7-week program for 5th graders, for 7th graders. And I basically came in the classroom to teach civility. And the goal was this. I walked in the classroom each time, and the introduction was, raise your hand if you see somebody being mean to other people. Raise your hand if you see it all the time. Last one, raise your hand if you think that's just the way the world is. I said, keep your hand there. I said, that's what we can't have. That you normalize it. I said, so just consider me a coach. And so I put on, little on the chalkboard, a little cross thing. And on one side, I said, okay, nice, kind, and polite, and mean, rude, and cruel. I said, if you practice any of these, you can get really good at them. I said, so I'm here for the next 7 weeks, and we're going to practice on being nice, kind, and polite. I'm your coach. And then I would go further. I said, so I know you don't understand it, but how many of you play sports? I said, okay, back in the day. So imagine instead of me today walking in, it was Barry Bonds, and all you play baseball. What would it be like if you had a day with Barry Bonds teaching you? Like, wow. I said, would it definitely up your skills? Like, yes. I said, well, I'm here to up your skills on being nice and kind and polite. So when I saw that, Tyler and Kirk, and I put it into action, here's what the results were. By going into the classrooms, now, when I worked for the police department, I was school-based. I oversaw 4 high schools, 4 middle schools, and 13 elementary schools on call. And I was back and forth, putting out fires and stuff. But it was an emerging gang thing. Worked with the gang members and so on. And so when I said, okay, let's put together this program. And then the second thing I did was I started the big models that were coming in that people were using was conflict mediation and conflict resolution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're going to mediate something, okay, maybe the two parties aren't willing to get along, so you stay away from each other. We mediate. Resolution, okay, you agree to kind of disagree, and you're going to do your best to get along. And these models weren't working because they wanted to empower some of the kids, but the kids who were actually the mediators, they were the bullies of the school.
Hmm.
And they weren't being helpful. But this is in its infant state. There people are trying. And then I realized something. I came up with what emerged from our work, Kirk, from Rollo, was a third option, and that was conflict reconciliation.
Hmm.
If you can reconcile in the moment where you're at, most divorces always end in irreconcilable differences. So here's how it played. Here's how this worked. Okay, so I get a couple of fifth graders that have been fighting, and they send them to me. We're going to go to the office or to a room, and I'm going to play good cop, bad cop. Okay, they see I'm a civilian. I have my badge. They just see that I'm with the police department. I'm a cop to them. I said, okay, so I'm going to do an investigation here as to what took place, and I just start just barking at them. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to ask you. You don't say anything until I'm done. Blah blah blah. Here we go. I got a piece of paper. I said, number one, how long have you guys been friends? Since kindergarten. I said, okay, you're really good friends. Like, yeah, we were best friends. Okay, good. That's all I needed to know. I'm going to start with you. Tell me all the positive things that you've done together. Sleepovers, snacks, snowboarding, all this. Like, okay, come on, no, you got more. I know there's more. Give it all to me. And then I do the same with both. Now I turn the paper over to side A. I go to side B. Now side B, tell me what went wrong. Well, he called my mom a name this morning. But why'd you call his mom a name? Because I was just in a bad mood. And what did you do? I hit him. And I hit him back. I said, okay, anything else ever negative ever happened between the two of you? And they're like, no. And then here's where I go bad cop on him. I go rogue. I hit my hand on the desk. I say, now I'm mad. You think you two are bad? I'm mad. And they're like, okay, why? I'm going to tell you why I'm mad. There's a crime here. And if I can take somebody, I can take somebody to jail over this, because here's what it is. And I hold up the piece of paper like this. I said, you see this side? See this whole side A? You're throwing it all away because of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're tossing it out the door. You're never going to talk to each other. I said, so we're going to do one or two things here, gentlemen. We're either going to, this is going to end here. You're not going to be friends. And I guarantee you're going to be adding more interest to this other side. And it's going to get worse. Or tell you what, the three of us together, we can make the next entry on the first side. Mm-hmm. Pretty soon we're shooting hoops or doing a board game or whatever. And it's reconciled. It brought them back to that. But the trouble I was running into when the teachers wanted punishment, they would say, when I say everything's fine, well, are they suspended? I'm like, no, it's okay. It's fine. This continue on, But pretty soon, once I got the principals on board with this and started doing staff trainings with this, it reduced the resentment because it never got to that far. So in the long run, what's that?
It wasn't being addressed.
At all.
Yeah.
And so in the long run, what it did, in 1994 is when Cecilia was killed in March. The following end of July, what got me to the city of Concord was there was an 8th grade classroom in a social work, they call it. It was a social works type thing of looking at societal issues. These 8th graders, they came up with a project and they got funding to open a teen center as a diversion. And it was a partnership between the city of Concord, the police department, and the school district, and New Connections Behavioral Agency. And so when I was offered and I got the job as teen center director, as we were training, I said, this Concord's on the rise, but things are coming up. I said, we have to look at the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is a teen leaves here on a Friday night and is gunned down. See, they weren't prepared. They didn't want it. And they said, well, why do you want to talk about that? And I said, because that's the reality here. And sure enough, 6 months into this whole thing, Richard Oriana was at a park with his girlfriend, and he was shot 7 times and was killed. And it was on. And so when I said it was on my watch, in a sense, I'm trying to help these kids. Watch not responsibility, but a opportunity to impact people. I was his pallbearer. I delivered his eulogy, hand delivered his casket to the grave while everybody sat there and cried and mourned his teen friends. And the most interesting thing was this: for all of us, who are helping people, care to help people, there's a certain intuitive part that comes through for us. We get an intuition about something, and we kind of know. And the week before Richard was killed, I was watching their actions in the teen center, and one of the girls came up, she's like, "Jim, what's wrong? You look sad." I'm like, "Rochelle, I got to tell you something. I've been trying to reach these kids, and they think it's a game. I know right now someone in this room is going to die." And sure enough, Richard did. So I vowed to do my best and not let that happen. So by going into the schools, getting the district on board, the police on board, everybody on board with reducing the resentment, we were able to take the city of Concord, and not very many people know about this since '94. We took it 12 and a half years without a single youth homicide.
Yeah.
12 and a half years.
Remarkable.
Right? There was a few adult ones, but the resentment wasn't at that level.
Right.
Now, right at the year when we were approaching 1999 to the new millennium, and I was doing a lot of speaking. Kirk, we have done presentations together. I got active, and everybody was just reaching for me. Okay, and that was fine. I was training interns, psych interns. The John Muir Medical Center in Walnut Creek had got funding for a program called Caught in the Crossfire. I ran that program where I was providing critical incident stress debriefing to victims as they were in the hospital, working with the trauma staff, working with the social workers, because they said they had a similar program in Oakland. They said every time the social workers come in, these kids just pull up the sheet, and I'm not talking to you. And they saw the stats were that 50% of these kids who were wounded within a couple of years were killed. And so that program working, then I started working with probation and judges and networking. I was just like everywhere, but it was it was putting together a network of not just the bullets, because of how do we stop the violence, how do we reduce the resentment, because a lot of the resentment is high. But if I can leave where I was and go straight into San Quentin prison, where I did some volunteer work before, and the resentment there is high between inmates, between guards themselves, and so on. And so when we hit 1999 and I saw this, I said, and I'll summarize it, or this part of it, so we can open up. It's one of your thoughts, both you and Tyler's thoughts on this, is that I said, you look at the stats and you look at what's going on nationwide, in worldwide. One could easily say that we have become more violent as we enter the new millennium. And how do we stop that gun control, trying kids as adults? The state of California passed the California Street Terrorism Act and all that sort of stuff. I said, but here's the reality, what I've seen out there in the field, is that we aren't more violent. The human race has become more petty. Because these kids and things, he looked at me wrong, or he did this, or he crossed out my name, and he disrespected me, and so on. So that's pettiness. I said, I'm out there in the trenches, and I feel pretty safe in the places that I go. I said, but where I feel the most vulnerable, that I could lose my life? I said, I'm standing in a Safeway store, and I'm one of these people. I'll put 3 tomatoes in a bag and spin it, and I'll count that as one item. And I'm standing in the 14 items or less, and somebody behind me count my items, and I'm over by 2 because he saw those other 2 tomatoes. And he tells me, and he gets in my face about it. I say, hey, please don't worry about it. Next thing you know, I got to worry because he's going to his car, and he's coming back in the store with a shotgun, and I'm about to die over 2 tomatoes. And it's what's happening. And so I said, here's where we're getting this resentment thing pretty much addressed. And I had the opportunity to to help people understand what's palpably present, so that they can come forward and say, how can I contribute to this? What can I bring to this? And there was a Japanese author that got wind of me, and he wrote it in his book. He interviewed quite a few times, like you did, Kirk, as well. And some people from Sweden came over, a magazine interview, and so it was starting to get out into the world about keeping the resentment to a level, just really keeping it to a minimum. But here's what I also noticed in the year 2000. I said, but here's what the change is going to be. It's going to be more difficult. With the resentment, I can step in between 2 warring gangs because I know what the resentment is, and we could, hey, this de-escalated. But where we're headed now is bitterness, and this is where we are today. Mm-hmm. People are bitter. The system, this recently killing of the CEO, that's bitterness. Mm-hmm. he's bitter, and I said, and you can't. Bitterness is different. I cannot step into the middle of a bitter scene because it's mob violence, and our whole world. And this was 20 years ago. I said, this is where we're headed, and here we are now. No, I'm not to say I knew everything was right. Okay, then I know what. How do we? This is what needs to be addressed as the bitterness. Yes, your recent book, one of your recent books, Kirk, on polarization in our society. That's where the bitterness comes from. I'm watching people, more and more families are fighting over Trump supporters and the left and the right and this and that and so forth. That the bitterness is on the rise.
It seems like, I really appreciate what you're saying about the resentment, the bitterness. It also seems like our society is pervaded by emotionally impoverished relationships. We're not meeting each other. We're not hearing each other, feeling each other, or understanding. We're so good with the outside, but we're not very good with the inside. And that's one of the things that we promote here with the core of Depth Healers is emotionally restorative relationships. Relationships where people feel seen and heard, and they get at the roots of their struggle. It seems to me that that's a lot of what you do in so many different ways, both through your counseling, and I know you also bring music and art to bear. But it's helping people see the more of who they are through being seen and heard, as opposed to just ignored, dismissed, especially caretakers not feeling like they have the time to really meet their kids, or the culture being so occupied with tech, and with lacking relationship as a priority. You're really bringing that to the fore. But I want to also take some time. I know we have limited time right now, but Tyler, do you have any more reflections or?
I do, yeah. And Jim, thank you so much for sharing that. We like to approach this in a conversational way, and don't really have set questions that we plan on touching on, more so topics that we'd like to discuss. And I just really appreciate the chance to hear from you in more of a longer form narrative to really get what it is that you've done and the subtlety that you talk about with the pause and lowering this resentment. You just recently mentioned, politics today, and these issues aren't new. The border and whatnot, those are not new issues. We know that, but something is different in today's political, community, I should say, and it speaks to this need to continue, as Kirk's mentioning, is to focus on the relationship, these emotionally restorative relationships. And I wanted to touch on, it sounds like you talked about this a little bit, but you did some work with the Ernest Becker Foundation, and you spoke about a couple examples of your work with some of the youth. I'm also curious about what their response has been to you introducing theories from people like Kierkegaard. What's that response like from the youth when how do you go about introducing these things? It sounds like you're kind of going through the back door. You're not bringing a book in going, listen, this is the guy, you're going to learn from him, but it's more your example of when the gentleman was on his way out and you kept calling his name. You're doing the work in the moment as opposed to trying to, pointing at the moon. The finger that points at the moon is the moon. What's this process like for you to introduce these ideas from existential therapy, from Rollo and Kirk and Kierkegaard, and the process and the response to that?
Thank you for that. again, I think where the confusion, Tyler, comes in, things are labeled. And people will read the label of something and they're going to have a reaction to it, an aversion or a reaction, or they can relate to it and so forth. Yeah. And when I read, when we go deep into these subjects, these topics, we're just going deep. And there's so much richness there. Mm-hmm. But this process has also been given another name that makes them shy away from it, and the term is rabbit hole. Mm. Yeah. People say, stay away from those rabbit holes. As a musician, I dive deep every day, and with existential thought, deep into these rabbit holes for the richness.
Because we don't want to go there. That's the response. I don't want to go there. Jim, mm-hmm. Start talking about this with me. I don't want to go there. Right? That's the rabbit hole.
That rabbit hole. And when Kirk introduced me to Kierkegaard, and I'm like, I could read it easily. And I went to, there's a place in Nevada, it used to be a bookstore there called a clean and well-lighted place for books. And I bought every book that I got on Kierkegaard and walked up to the counter and with this big stack of books. And the guy behind the counter was like, oh, I feel bad for you. I had to read that in college. I was like, are you reading it? I said, no, I was just reading it for actually like just for fun. Really? He's like, what? Matter of fact, when I received an award through the agency that kept the crisis, when Susie Moore was her name, she's like, Jim amazes me. I saw him one time in McDonald's, and I walked up and I said, hey, what are you doing? He was reading. I said, what are you reading? He goes, Kierkegaard. He goes, who reads Kierkegaard in McDonald's? I'm like, oh, that's me, And so
we need more of that.
And so but I'm searching out in that rabbit hole, the richness is wisdom. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of wisdom there from experience and other people's experiences. Now, Kirk introduced me to Neil Alge, who was the president of the Ernest Becker Foundation. And Neil and I, Kirk recommended, referenced me to him. And we met at the Clean and Well-Lighted Place for Books because he was visiting his daughter in Nevada, and he was from Seattle. And so he asked me if I would start to come up, and I started coming in every year to the conferences and speaking. And in one of the conferences, and this started in 97, and one of the conferences, there was a woman who presented, and she was doing case studies on domestic violence, people who were mandated, and she was doing a study on them. And what she found was two things that was prevalent for both of them. And she found this through a dialogue, through getting a narrative going, not just a questionnaire thing, but having them opening up and sharing, like purposes, speaking from it, of what went wrong. And she noticed two things that were present that with all of them in comparison to the group that wasn't violent. And the two things was, one, they had never learned to self-soothe. Because in their macho thing, if I came in like with Julio and we're going to start teaching self-soothing, like I ain't taking no bubble bath, okay, so what? So I'm out of here. But self-soothing, especially for men, I found a very approachable way for them to embrace it. I say it this way. See, self-soothing is, we're talking about something the friction is coming up inside you. And you could go into a rage, you could, all this stuff has happened. I said, so I'm not talking about self-soothing from the external. Just calm it down. I said, let's take a car engine, for example. Let's just use this as a perfect example. The radiator from outside pumps in water to take away the heat. If you don't have that water, the car overheats. It'll burn up. But now internally, you have engine oil. Mm-hmm. That oil helps to stop the friction. There's a lot of metal hitting metal. I said, so now imagine this. If your situation is this, you're an engine and you're running it without oil. And this is why, so the self-soothing I'm talking about is how do we get the right oil inside there? And so here's what the oil is, though. There's the second part. So the first thing is self-soothing. And what came from that, too, was that, see, as we're speaking, interacting as people, friends, and this is it's an intercommunication. As I'm speaking right now, I'm the sender. Kirk and Tyler, you're the receivers. You hear what I'm saying? And when reverse, and Kirk started talking, you're the sender, and Tyler and I are the receivers. And that's, the inter. But now what came out of this talk also was about the intra. Mm-hmm. That inside of ourselves, there was a sender and a receiver. The selves, what these men had, they had no intra-communication skills at all. And that was the oil that was lacking. And so, for example, I'll give an example of how this, to illustrate this. Kirk and I get together. I come to his house, let's say, as I have in the past and will in the future, and get together for lunch or just hang out and talk and just hang out and further our friendship in the dialogue. Well, Kirk opens the door, and maybe I'm a few minutes late in traffic, and he just snaps at me, which you never would do, Kirk, but so this is the illustration. No. And he snaps at me. Hey, Jim, and see, well, because I have these good inter-communication skills, I can step back and say, whoa, wait, I wonder what's going on with Kirk, and is something going wrong? Let's kind of take a look at that, and give him that space. If I don't have those skills, I instantly take it personally.
You don't know how else to, what else are you using to reference for your response? Mm-hmm. You're not aware that you need oil in this analogy. Mm-hmm. Replace it.
And so people take it very personally. This is the bitterness today. It's our world engine is low on oil, okay, and there's not some, and so we become reactive, not active. So if somebody asks me, what's the difference between yourself now and where you were years ago? My intra-communication skills is running up and running strong, because I can take a step back and I can see that where before I was all reactive. I go beat someone up or go off on somebody or, end up in a divorce. It's that communication is not there within ourselves.
Another way to look at this, Jim, is handling our anxiety, right? We're not very good at developing the skills to work with our anxiety. Mm-hmm. Years. So we're running on fear often.
Oh, yes.
Rather than the pause, taking a step back, like you were saying in that moment, taking a look at the situation, the bigger situation, not just one thing that needles me, one thing that hits me. Okay. And so everything gets reduced to that, oh, he's trying to put me down, or he's dismissing me.
Oh, yes.
There's a lot going on here. Maybe there is a little piece there, but maybe the bigger piece is he's not communicating with himself in a soothing way, like you say. He feels devalued. He's not able to come from a larger place, a larger picture of our relationship and what really matters in the situation. Mm-hmm. Does the irritation really matter in comparison to our friendship, to our love for one another, our bond? How do you help people into the bigger picture? And that takes depth, it takes relationship, it takes time. I'm just riffing on a lot that I'm hearing from you.
Yeah. And patience. Because then there within lies the patience. And, in humor. We've been friends long enough, I could easily say, okay, hey, Kurt, I was only 5 minutes late and you're this angry. I'm curious about something. I'll be back in 10 minutes. I want to see how much angry you're 10 minutes late. It's just like, okay, this is, and so now if you look at this, let's take it from an academic perspective. The people, are listening like, okay, well, how does this translate academically? So give them give a little square one. If you were to Google right now, inter-communication skills, how to build them and all that, you get books, you get all kinds of stuff. Trust me, try Googling intra-communication skills and really very little comes up. Nothing comes up. Sure. But here's what it is. Intra-communication, I said, okay, well, where can I read it? But then I'm like, no, it's been there all along. It's wisdom. The books that you write, Tyler, the things that you write, which you speak to, everybody's listening to, other people I know that through the Interspectrum Foundations, other therapists, all these people, in academia and stuff. It's your wisdom. It's if they can read, like I clearly understood the wisdom of Rollo May, and that contributed heavily to my intra communication skills. It's wisdom,
and you internalize that wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where the internal is. That's where once it's internalized, then you're like people. I make a comment. It's like when I would go to the classrooms and the kids are all jumping around, and had somebody who was co-teaching with me, like, aren't you going to like no? So I'm going to wait for them to get themselves together. 30 minutes, and the teacher's standing there. 15 minutes go by. Now they get into the fun of it. Like, oh, the periods over. I said, well, you missed out on the first 15 minutes. We could have been doing this, and that's okay. So my understanding of myself, a lot of people don't have patience for my patients, and they're like, why aren't you doing anything? But here's so again, on a level of academia, if we start to read other people's works, whether it's Kierkegaard, whether it's Fromm, whether it's, and here's the thing about Becker, his wisdom is that when we look for that wisdom, then we can share that wisdom through our own intercommunication into the intercommunication. And what I found interesting about Becker was this, and I don't want to offend anybody about Becker. See, Becker's work, his most, his books, Denial of Death stuff, for some reason never really struck a chord with me.
Mm-hmm.
It was his other books, The Birth and Death of Meaning, and so forth. That because two things about Becker that helped me understand myself, and you, Kirk, and Tyler, without really knowing you yet, I can hone in on this really quickly. That each of us are influenced by someone else's work, and that's what brings out that part. That's what feeds into our calling.
Yes,
that part of ourself that's going to be called forward. And so when I read Becker's work, and I would go to the conference, and I hear a lot of people, don't get me wrong, speaking about the death and this and that. I said, well, wait a minute, and I would speak to the other part. But so we got the full spectrum of Becker, and on the other spectrum is this: that he writes two things in his book. I think it's The Birth and Death of Meaning. He writes in the beginning. He says, if it wasn't for my students, I would never have written any books.
Mm-hmm.
It was because they're urging that I took everything that I had and compiled into books. And the reason, he says, so therefore, all the works that I do, all the writings that I is in honor, or basically in dedication to our cheated and anguished youth at the time. Yeah. And they're cheated and anguished because the adults around them cannot come to an agreed upon approach of existence, really, basically what he's saying, and move forward. And that was dated in June of 1968, and I was one of those youths in 1968 that he was speaking to that was cheated and anguished, but it came through. And so your works, Kirk, Tyler, whatever they mean, what they are, will continue to be, and other people listening to it are invaluable in a sense in the realm of building that intercommunication skills for us. This wisdom.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jim, and I definitely have a very similar experience. Reading Kirk's work a few years ago, and seeing it in the academic journals and Saybrook University under his name, and now that's where I'm halfway through my PhD degree. And when I first read Kirk's work, I remember Kirk, I've shared this with you, but I remember kind of putting the book down at one point and thinking, someone just read my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, he's been doing this longer than I have, so it's not that he took my ideas, but that there was this shared sense of we're on the same wavelength towards something, and he is verbalizing it in a way that I have only dreamt of. And you're kind of hopping on that freight train line of saying, I don't know where you're going, but I know that we're on the same path wherever that is. I don't know what the destination is, but we're both going up that hill, and we're both going to go through this tunnel, because this is the the ride that I'm on as well. And I felt a sense of kind of hitching to the same wagon, um, because there was this just kind of kinship in the thought and that wisdom of, geez, he's taking the time. Clearly, this matters to him. But he's writing about all these things that I'm thinking of,
Mm.
and you're I think we're drawn to wanting to connect with that and say, and for you to reach out to Rollo, that was a similar sense of, you could have just picked up the book and been moved by it. But what drew you specifically to say, I want to talk to him now? There was something that was so strong, and I'm sure if Kierkegaard was around, it would be a similar thing of, how do I get in touch with him? Because you in that experience with that person and feel their presence. Something I noticed from Kirk very early on that I hope to do in my life is to embody these principles, not just when I'm working with others, but just in my everyday life. I mean, to be with Kirk is a very well-known experience that everybody that I've talked to that is with him says the same thing. He's just a very sweet, amazing, kind person that has an unbelievable amount of presence. And when he's with you, he's with you. And why would I not want to reach out to that person and know that to a better degree?
I'm overwhelmed by the reduction. Me, because I feel that from both of you very much as well. I feel this is very much a mutual discovery process and mutual learning, and I just want to add that beyond the work being so important and that I internalize as well, I had great mentors, as you both know, in Rollo and Jim Bugental, among others. But it was the witnessing, and I know that's really powerful for you, Jim. People being witnessed by you uh, uh, internalize that, and that's part of the self-soothing. It certainly was for me, and the critical therapy that you had with Paul. So I had a critical therapy with Anne when I was in very bad shape in graduate school and breaking down seriously. And this woman helped to save my life, really. And it's held 45 years, 50, almost 50 years. So that witnessing can be so powerful, the human to human.
Oh, yes, Kirk. And I would add, and I'm glad you brought this up because I didn't want to leave this out, that Paula, her name was Paula Young, was my therapist. She also saw the calling. She saw the parts of myself that to get to. The most interesting thing is, like some people say, how come you're Jim and sometimes you're Jimmy? Well, it was an interesting thing she did. Early on into my recovery, into my sessions with her, she's like, Jimmy? I'm like, yeah, Paula. She's like, from this point on, I'm never ever going to call you Jimmy again. I'm calling you Jim. And I'm like, okay, why? She's like, because Jimmy comes with this whole stuff. Basically, I look like, because Jim is the person that we want to call forward. And this is who got called forward to the work. So recently I've gone back to Jimmy in a lot of things I do. So I'm both. I have both these things now. That witness part, she was my therapist for 21 and a half years.
Wow.
Nonstop. And some people think, well, if you had you needed a therapist for 21 and a half years, you must have been pretty messed up. It's like, no, yeah, that's one way people would look at it.
The opposite. Yeah.
But the opposite was that she was more than just a life coach. She was that witness. And when we ended our sessions, she wrote me a very beautiful letter. And she said, I was witness to you taking violence in transforming it into creativity. And Rollo's book, The Courage to Create, in Tyler, in question or in response to some of the things you mentioned about actually handing these materials to them, I have actually handed this one girl that seventh grader in middle school, I handed her a copy of the Parables of Kierkegaard. Another young kid on junior college, he was reading on the campus one day Rollo May, The Courage to Create, and this Latino kid and this therapist or this instructor walked by, and he was just blown away. He's like, "What are you reading there?" I said, "Where'd you get that?" It's like, "It was handed to me, you know." Now, where I'm having fun with this, and it's been hard before to talk to people about, these teachings and his way of life. Where all this has led me to, believe it or not, is to the Mormon Church. And the Mormon Church, in a sense, these young missionaries that I work with that come through here, I can talk all day long in Kierkegaard, and they get it. Mm-hmm. They're in tune with it. And so someone say, why are they in tune with it? Well, because what Kierkegaard is speaking to is this. His book, one of the books I read continuously is Purity of Heart is to will one thing, the good. And he goes through this whole thing about describing what the eternal is outside of God and so forth. Kierkegaard, but what he's saying is hard to do, very difficult to do the good in a temporal setting because it's going to be double-minded. Even if you're saying, I'm going to do this to help people, there's something attached to it.
Yeah.
To be able to be pure in it of the heart, which means the authority that is coming from is the eternal itself. Mm-hmm. And so when I speak to this on the eternal presence of existence, not the eternal in the sense of in time of infinity, mm-hmm. but the eternal presence of our existence is here all along. And this is what everybody's speaking to existentially, that it is here and it's accessible and not accessible, but we can access it. And to our own calling, and then we'll be surprised to find out who we are. When I was mentoring with you, Kirk, and I brought up the book, the Divine Comedy, and you mentioned that witness of Dante and Virgil, having that witness there. And so I've witnessed a lot in this world, and if I had witnessed it in a sense of outside of looking, if I only looked at it, I probably couldn't even have this conversation with you. I'd be a mess. But by seeing it, what Kierkegaard is leading to, with Nietzsche, all these people, Rollo May, yourselves included, may not be aware of it, is an invitation to see the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. I read a lot of books on shamanism, and I'm glad you introduced me to Stanley Krippner, and his work and that stuff, because another part of myself, Tyler, is I'm a medicine man. I'm a shaman. I'm a healer. And I brought this into that work, meaning that on a more scientific level, on the level that we're speaking, and not just feathers and smoke and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And to be able to be there for people, to show up. I couldn't show up to that calling, to those parts of myself, because they were inaccessible to me. And with this work, through this life that I live, it's been amazing. And so with the people in the Mormon Church, I'm not completely. I like to teach. I like where their philosophy is coming from. And the more I talked with these kids and read the information of this church, I'm like, this has got Kierkegaard all over it. Okay, and so I said, there's got to be a connection. So about a year ago, I started researching, looking through at BYU their classes, and sure enough, there it was. They have because with most religion they have is theology or theology classes. Well, they have a whole department of the psychology of religion, and it's all based on Kierkegaard and Heidegger. And it was mind blowing. And it's like, okay, there's the Venn diagram. There's the overlap. Now, the way it's being understood, the way it's being taught and explored, I would say, at BYU is this: that they see Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is viewed as how to apply the eternal and how the interactions and the function of it. Heidegger's work is more on the creation of the eternal, the essence of it. And they've written books. I have one that's called Appropriating Heidegger. I have one of the professors wrote there. And so my next venture is to get myself into BYU and start mixing with these people to say, okay, I want to learn more about the philosophy, meaning philosophy in and of itself. The essence of philosophy is basically not on analytical and coming to an understanding of something. It's the experience. It's the exploration of it. Your books, Kirk, of awe. It's being able to explore philosophically and say, there it is. I get it. That makes sense to me. It makes sense to a deeper part of myself. And then the deeper part of myself, and I can be comical about it, says, yeah, we know that. We knew that all along. We're waiting for you to finally get it, but welcome aboard. Welcome aboard.
Awesome to learn something new every day too, or be open to that. Mm-hmm. Hearing about your connection with the Mormon Church and the openness to philosophy is really fascinating. That could be a whole other program, perhaps, but also reminds me when you talk about Kierkegaard and eternity, I think of Spinoza talking about living under the aspect of eternity.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing line, as distinct from living under the aspect of, the suit of clothes that other people think you should wear, or just something monetary or military or what have you, or judgmental, but to live in connection with the amazement of cosmic unfolding, in a sense, of the vastness that's around us and that we're all connected to and traveling through. That is lifting to me. That is awe, as you say. It lifts us out of the petty and narrow identifications that make us bitter so often and resentful.
Oh, yes.
You're bringing that on.
Thank you. And Tyler and Kirk, I can't say enough about not just a passion for reading. There's this, you probably are well familiar, it's called a confirmation bias.
Sure, yeah.
Woman is thinking about having a baby, and the next thing you know, everywhere she looks, she sees pregnant women. You buy a certain type of car and you're driving down the road, you never noticed it before, but there's the same car that you're driving.
Everybody has it.
And so we have these confirmation biases. And so what happens in a case where your confirmation bias is something that is part of that calling? And for me, the confirmation bias was about wisdom. And so whether I read the Stoics, and I see the wisdom there, and the Sufis, and going into Khalil Gibran's work and his poetry and so forth, there is the wisdom. And it confirms not so much passages and stuff like it confirms that, wow, wisdom is just like awesome. It balances me. It puts me in this place that I can show up for others. And this has been, if somebody again was to say, okay, if you were to boil it, sum it down to one thing about what you do and how you are for other people, is that I do everything I possibly can to be emotionally available to others.
Mm-hmm. A good way to put it. Yeah.
Emotionally available.
I was just going to say, I love the confirmation bias of wisdom, because that's a confirmation bias that keeps on ticking.
Yes, it does. It's the gift that keeps given. The gift that keeps on giving, Kirk, and
growing.
And when I say emotionally available to people, it's because when somebody is in an existential crisis, that they're lost, they have no bearings. And what I do the best I can for someone is get them off the details of it. My wife, the death, this and that. So I'm help you navigate, because I've been there myself, through the emotions of this. Do we get to the other side? And I love a quote that I recently read that says something like this. The passage of "This too shall pass."
Yes.
When we're in this deep, horrible existential crisis, we focus on the word "pass." When is it going to pass? I got to get through. That's understandable. That's a reaction. But if you really look at the whole sentence, now let's zero in on the word "shall." Mm-hmm. It shall. It shall. Okay, I'm going to have faith that it'll pass. And then I love this quote because it says, "And once it passes, where are we? we find ourselves in the realm of grace, of joy, and where smiles live.
Mm.
And that takes me straight back in my early reading of Rollo May in his book, My Quest for Beauty.
Mm.
What I love about Rollo May as a person, see, he was an artist way before he was ever a therapist.
True. Yeah.
And he mentions Alfred Adler in Greece because he was taking art classes from Adler. Okay. Everybody, we're artists in our own way. And we had that emotional breakdown because he was so used to the fast pace of life, and they were saying, just take it easy. And it broke him. And he ends up in the mountains, as the story, his experience goes. And this pack of wolves surround him, and it's raining, and he gets to this little village up there, and he gets some dry clothes. And the next morning, he wants to take all note of this, and gets a scrap of paper and broken Greece. He's doing this, and one of the people says, "What are you writing?" And he goes, "What is life?" And they all laughed at it and say, "What is life? If you don't have bread, you die. That's life." Mm. Then he ventured out the next day, and you see the illustration they actually drew. He comes to distill the poppies, and there's the picture there, and he says, that's his quest for beauty, and I'm on that same path. Adventure is him. Journey is, he says, in that moment that he sees this field of poppies, a sense of peace and a sense of joy happen simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Where he says sometimes you can have a sense of peace, and later on you have joy in it, and vice versa. But when it happens simultaneously, it's like you're in that place of where grace and joy and smiles live. You're in this really neutral, beautiful place. And that's what I have done for a lot of people. I will ask people, it says, when's the last time, I call it, you had your at the same time you had your spirits lifted and your soul stirred. And then, well, it says, this is what I live for, and more that I go to nature a lot. I go hiking. I do all this sort of things. And I have a moment where lately I've been, in the last 5 years, I've learned to cut and polish stones. And I look at a certain stone like this one here the other day that came out just like really sweet. And it brought me that sense of peace and a sense of joy, this piece of agate, I'm like, wow, this is cool, and it's nice. And so I'll sum it up with this. In our existence, whether it's 5,000 years ago or 5,000 years from now, you can live a very cool life and not have to pay a heavy price for it. Like trying to be some cool biker on some extended panel bars or something. Look, I'm cool, and but you can just be cool just intrinsically within yourself, and people will gravitate to that like you wouldn't believe. And it's and that's the joy and the beauty of what I feel Rollo May speaks to from his experiences.
That authenticity, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, this feels like a beautifully fitting way to come to a close for our mutual adventure, and soul stirring. Mm-hmm. I feel lifted and stirred in my soul through our conversation today.
Nice.
And thank you so much, Jim, for giving. Yeah, you're a gift that keeps on giving.
Thank you.
We've actually, this could be limitless. We've gone well over the borders of our usual time, but I think that's absolutely imperative that we did, and that you're on record with the amazing life that you've lived and continue living, and that have offered to others. Life.
Yes.
In its fullness. And so, Tyler, I don't know if you have some concluding thoughts or.
Well, I will echo that, Kirk, and I just want to thank you so much, Jim. I know we didn't have any prior experience of each other before this, and I feel I've learned so much from you, and I've learned quite a bit about you and from you, and took some notes. We're working on a certificate program that we're going to offer folks through the Core of Depth Healers, and I have a lot of ideas that I got from you. So I think we'll definitely be in touch, if not personally, just to catch up. But I have more questions that you stirred in me, and to be able to to share this time with you and witness you as a beautiful person. And I see why you have a long friendship with Kirk. Two wonderful people, and I'm happy to have been able to be with both of you this morning to share that. So I'm so happy as well that we've had this chance to record this too. There's such a wonderful message for folks. And the goal with what we do with the Core of Depth Healers is not only to inform depth psychologists, but anybody that can benefit from this information. And I feel that this is such a great example of that, a really wonderful way that you can still make a big impact. You're using these tools from depth psychology and the philosophers, and you're not a licensed psychologist. And there's so much to be done in the world with this vast body of knowledge that we have. So thank you for being such a great example of how that can be used.
You're a licensed wisdom teacher.
That's right.
I have licensed you.
I will add this. It's kind of it's interesting to know. When I was working under the license of a psychologist with the New Connections Behavioral Counseling Agency, and I'm working side by side with all the interns and psychologists and so forth, and they're like, "How are you getting so much done out there?" I said, "Well, I'll be honest with you. I have no paperwork that I don't have to write this up when I'm done." You both know that the amount of writing that after a session, needs to take place, that I just show up and then I leave. And so I said, that's been maybe what the Rollo saw. I'm like, Jim, I'm going to spare you later in life of having to write all that time spent. And I'm not, but that has its place, of course. It's amazing. And so you both do amazing work, Tyler. Looking forward to I consider you a friend now, and the friendship. And I'll also, what I'm looking forward to, is I mentioned that I was in this place after 10 years of, and I've healed that. My heart and soul is open to the kids that I've lost. And so I'm also looking at, Kirk, maybe perhaps you and I can present again somewhere. I'm looking to get back out here,
Good. Coming up for air.
Back in the thick of it.
Let's get back in touch. And,
sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Well, again, thank you for the invite to be here today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.